New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the topic of mystical luminosity, and my guest is Jonathan Dinsmore, who is the author of Mystical Luminosity Experience, an initiation of a construct grounded in phenomenology, which is based on his Master of Science thesis in psychology at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. And now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Hey, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's a delight to welcome a new scholar to the New Thinking Aloud channel. We have done a lot of interviews with senior people, but it's always exciting to me to see somebody who is basically beginning their professional career in the exploration of consciousness, mysticism, the paranormal, and you definitely fit into that category. I think that your work is exciting, exploring or trying to amplify the concept of mystical luminosity, which is, it's like been around forever, but you're really trying to shine the spotlight on the spotlight, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of funny. I was working with Dr. Hood as my advisor when I began researching this, and he and I would sort of talk about how basically it's always been under our noses, but it wasn't really something that people pointed out too often or made a point of studying. And so I'm excited to be initiating, essentially, the construct of mystical luminosity experience.
I know you're an experimental psychologist. You have a Master of Science degree right now. And so your approach is to see if we can't pin this concept down with some empirical data.
Right. Essentially. I mean, of course, nothing that we ever measure is, the measure is never equivalent to the thing that we measure, but in as far as we consider it to be a valid thing to do to measure types of sort of extraordinary experiences like mystical experiences, which has been measured to a large extent and also in psychedelic research context, to the extent that we can do that, yes, I think that this is a perfectly valid way to study mystical luminosity experience for sure.
But obviously, it's an experience that people have reported in almost every culture, in almost every historical period. The literature about it is absolutely vast, and we'll summarize some of that literature for the benefit of our viewers. I think it excited me, Jonathan, that you chose as your archetypal example of mystical luminosity to quote from the writings of Federico Fagin, because coincidentally, about 2 weeks before we release this video, we will have released my interview with him, in which he talks about a profound mystical experience that changed his life. But perhaps you could summarize what he reported.
Absolutely, I can. So in Fagin's description of his mystical luminosity experience, it would certainly fit the description or category of mystical luminosity experience that I'm working on. Essentially, he was laying in bed. It was over the holidays. It was around Christmas time, I believe. And it was in a category that I would categorize as spontaneous. Essentially, there was no precursor to it that was recognizable. There was no psychedelic taken. There was no intense contemplative practice happening, as far as I know. He just laid there and out of nowhere, which is actually a major category. Whenever you look at the sort of numbers of those categories, at least how participants endorse those categories, spontaneous is a really common one. So essentially, he described it as a feeling of love that also felt like light emerging from his heart center, you might say, or from his heart. And it also felt like energy. He actually describes it as energy dash love in his writing, emerging from his chest. And so basically he says that it clearly feels like love, but also is this light that seems to pervade the universe. I'm paraphrasing, of course. And that it felt alive and like it had, of course, the feeling of love. And he even says, he had this, inexplicable knowing, an understanding that just nothing was explained to him. It just came. It was there, that emerged, that essentially this was that which the universe is made out of. And, whenever this, substance, so to speak, knows itself, that feels like love. And so it's just a very fascinating, very vivid account of the experience. And so especially being by a significant figure in science and technology, I just thought it was a great way to start.
We're talking about the man who essentially invented the microprocessor.
That's right. And he's like a polymath. I mean, he's done many different interesting things from my understanding, but yeah, and he had a mystical luminosity experience, and now he's doing things like talking to the Essentia Foundation, working on idealism and things like that. I've been seeing him go and, speak with them and stuff like that. So yeah, he's doing a lot of cool things in the world.
That experience, which I believe occurred to him in 1990, was a turning point in his life. Prior to that time, he describes himself as a conventional materialist scientist and also very dissatisfied with his life in spite of having achieved enormous success. And subsequently, and of course it took some time, he went through a period of transpersonal therapy to work through the experience, but now he is one of the leading theorists in the field of consciousness.
Yeah, and it does tend to be a turning point. That's one of the most notable ways that it has been discussed even before I started to research it. Near-death researchers have pointed out that near-death experiences that include the light tend to be more transformative. Eliade described it as, I can actually quote it here, whatever his previous ideological conditioning, a meeting with the light produces a break in the subject's existence, revealing to him or making clearer than before the world of the spirit of holiness and freedom. In brief, existence as a divine creation or the world sanctified by the presence of God. So it's notable, it's a pattern that you readily observe that when people have this experience, it tends to totally transform their views of the world.
If we dig deeper into Fagin's description of his experience, he indicates that he felt that he was that light, but also that that light was the origin of the entire physical universe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or the substance from which it was made, I believe are his words, yes. So it's interesting to think of it as a substance, but yeah, absolutely. It seems in many people's experience, they feel that it is the ultimate, that is the nature of the divine. And those things all don't always occur together. There's some indications from the research, which I find really interesting, in terms of being a scientist studying these experiences, that the phenomenological qualities, or in other words, the subjective qualities of the experience actually shape what beliefs it leads the person to have. For instance, a person who experiences it emanating from a being or an object will tend more towards supernatural interpretations, whereas somebody who experiences the entire world being illuminated might have a bit more unitive or mystical interpretations. So that's an interesting aspect as well.
I know in a previous interview, I'm not sure this has come up in your own research, about the great science fiction writer Philip K. Dick. He had an experience of luminosity, and it occurred, if I remember correctly, in a rather strange way. Some person came knocking on his door, and he went to answer the door, and I think it was a woman, and she was wearing a pin, and the sunlight caught the pin in a particular way. It reflected back into his eyes, and that was the trigger for this experience of mystical luminosity for him that colored the rest of his writing.
Wow. I wasn't aware of that. So the deeper I get into this, the more I hear major figures actually having this experience that I had never heard of. Another one was Nikola Tesla. I heard somebody describing how he had luminosity experience. And it's interesting that the spark is the trigger, because I think in some traditions they actually use things like looking at the sun or looking at flames as a trigger to almost sort of remind them and sort of bring it forward in their consciousness somehow. That the nature of this mystical light as opposed to just a physical light coming in through the eyes. So perhaps that's a mechanism by which it can come forth.
It is interesting, and maybe since you're a psychologist and not a theologian, it's a confounding variable for you that the religious traditions in almost every culture describe this mystical light, and they do it in the context of their own theologies.
Yes. And, that has to be the case. That would also be the case with mystical experience or any other type of, in as much as we understand the types of transcendental, non-ordinary, we have a million different names for this category of experience, unfortunately, but this category of experience, to the extent that we think that it's been happening and contributing to the development of religions and mysticism throughout history, necessarily those are taking place in a cultural context. And so it would be silly to ignore that, of course. And therefore the framework within which the person, because one of the key things, this is noteworthy in the phenomenological interviews that I did, one of the things that they described was this difficulty because they have no framework for it. Like a person coming from a religious background, one of them described being frustrated in a way because they're sort of frustrated that this hasn't been talked about and that they don't have any framework to understand it. And that leads them on a quest of then looking outside of their traditional religion or even a secular perspective and examining, for instance, the writings of mystics in order to try to have a conceptual framework to somehow integrate it into all the other things they know about life and their experience of reality, normal experience of reality. Its integration is challenging.
Well, I'm surprised now that anyone would think that their religion doesn't talk about it. Surely in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we have, right, in the book of Genesis, God said, let there be light, and there was light. That was the beginning of creation itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And in John chapter 1, which is my favorite chapter of the Bible, there is the word, or actually logos in Greek, being described as the light of all people, and the light of the world and the light of all people, essentially. So there are many references to it. I believe in Quran there's a book that begins with God is the light of the heavens and the earth. There are many references in Buddhism, and there's quite a bit of debate as to how metaphorical or literal that is. But yeah, I mean, as I go into in my book, and really I just scratched the surface, but it is almost ubiquitous. I struggle to think of a type of religion anywhere that doesn't have it. It's even in elements of what's been called shamanism or, indigenous traditions as well.
And of course, you have some religions that make it really central, like with the Zoroastrians.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is essentially based on that, and even what people think of, my understanding of it is that even what people think of as fire worship is sort of using the fire as symbolic of that more divine light. And that's, who knows how, all the ways that that's influenced. And these things these traditions all influence one another. The Christian tradition and their focus on light was influenced by Neoplatonism. And it goes on and on, but essentially, you can find it in virtually every area. There's types of Sufism, there's specific philosophies. It's in Kabbalah, the Or Ein Sof, or Ein Sof Or, depending on where you're at, is, this infinite light. And essentially, at least in Lurianic Kabbalah, I know, it's hard to be an expert on every single thing, but essentially in Lurianic Kabbalah, there's this infinite light, and the reality as we know it in all its different levels, including the heavenly levels, are like a prismatic sort of reduction of this light, which in its full effulgence is just a sort of infinity. And so, there's just so many fascinating ways that people have attempted to convey what they realized in the experience, especially how it interacted with their cultural context. and came to be understood and resulted in these conceptual structures. And they're all very interesting. As you said, I'm a psychologist, and so it's not a problem that it's been described in so many ways per se, but it is essentially, the thing that I am focused on more so is contemporary experience reports, because we have so much access to so much rich information. In a way, it's interesting how all the religions and systems of mysticism have tried to conceptualize it or tried to communicate it. But also, that domain in which we have the most access to the most empirical data about it is, of course, experiences today. And so that's really the focus of my research. But I really enjoyed doing the entire, like I said, kind of scratching the surface, but still fairly extensive review of how it's appeared in various traditions.
Well, I do want to explore the phenomenological investigations you've done with contemporary individuals. But before we get into that, I think for the benefit of our viewers, there's an important issue in the philosophy of mysticism, which is worth getting into, a controversy between, I guess you could call it the perennialists versus the people who feel that we can never know what mystics are really saying because it's all culturally dependent, and the assumption that there is a unity of experience amongst all mystics is unjustified.
Right. Yeah. And, as with most sort of dichotomies or debates, I think the ultimate answer is always something in between, like the nature-nurture debate. I mean, it's a well-understood thing that both play a role and they even interact with each other and things like that. And so with any of these kind of debates like this, I think any reasonable person is going to arrive at something in the middle. Of course, it does seem like it's obvious, even just from looking at the phenomenology of the experiences, it does seem like religion plays a role. Religious symbolism will show up in the experiences. But at the same time, people from different backgrounds, from different cultures, are describing this very similar experience. I often like to use the metaphor or the example of the heart attack to illustrate in what's, in my opinion, the appropriate way of thinking about this, which is, heart attacks happen everywhere. It's a physiological thing as we understand it. It occurs in all cultures. People get heart attacks everywhere. But you may or may not be aware that different cultures have different concepts of what's happening when a heart attack happens, and have throughout the ages. Of course, they've thought differently about what that is. But at the same time, we, from a scientific perspective now, kind of understand that there is something going on physiologically that is occurring all across contexts and in these different cultural, even though they had different ways of understanding it and framing it in different cultural contexts, we do understand that really there is a single thing happening. And, that's a choice that we make. And, people who want to subscribe to a more contextualist interpretation or constructivist interpretation are welcome to look at it that way. But in my opinion, we definitely are more so getting somewhere by examining it as in terms of its qualities that we can see do occur in different cultures, regardless of the person's cultural background and things like that. So in a way, trying to approach that debate via any particular type of experience is almost kind of a category error, because really you're trying to debate frameworks via a particular experience, and that doesn't really make sense. It's like a level of analysis error, in my opinion. And so whenever that we get into that, I don't engage with it too much, because I'm coming at it from a scientific framework, and that assumes that there are that there are types of experiences that are happening in different cultural frameworks. It just makes more sense like that in the framework. And so, I'm open to criticisms from those other perspectives, but this is the framework I operate in.
In contemporary times, we've got many reports of the near-death experience. And classically, according to Raymond Moody, who described it back in 1975, many, not all, many people experience the idea of moving through a tunnel towards the light as
absolutely
part of that experience. It's sort of a classical way of thinking about it at this point.
Right. It's the archetypal near-death experience. I mean, near-death experience is essentially defined as a set of features that a person has most often near death. And the light in the near-death experience is actually the way that most people have heard of mystical luminosity. Whenever people ask me what I study, I say mystical luminosity experience, I'm like, what's that? The first thing I say is, well, have you heard of near-death experiences and people have an experience of the light? And they're like, oh yeah, I've heard that. At least people have heard that just in passing. And so I say, well, basically it's that, but I'm theorizing that it occurs in all these other contexts. And usually that's my 20-second way of explaining it to people.
That's one common way it's experienced. Another obvious way, which is becoming more and more scrutinized in scientific laboratories these days, is the psychedelic experience.
Yeah, and, in most psychedelic studies, it hasn't been measured because there hasn't been a measure. I'm creating the first measure. I've created the first measure and validated it and all that. But it's clear, at least in qualitative reports from psychedelic participants in psychedelic studies, and also just from the broader psychedelic literature, some anthropological investigation of ayahuasca, for instance, that this experience of this light with these mystical qualities is highly prevalent. Exactly how prevalent, we'll need to use the measure to discover, but it's certainly, I think, more prevalent in some than others. One that's particularly well known for having it is 5-MeO-DMT. People tend to have a sort of either void or a luminous, pure luminous experience. At least that's the way that they often describe it. And so that's why we need a measure, because we want to know things like, how common is this with this substance, with that substance, in this context, in that context. And for all of those things, you need a measure. So although the measure will never fully capture the experience, of course, as measures never fully capture anything, it is very useful to be able to measure it to an extent.
What we're talking about here is a psychological inventory that you have developed where people can begin to report the qualities and the nuances associated with their experience.
Yeah, it's a measurement instrument. It's a survey instrument, essentially, that the one that I've put out to the world for researchers to use at this point in my monograph is the MLE-11. So it's a set of 11 items that describe the experience as people typically describe it. The purpose is for the items to essentially summarize the way that it is the ways in which it is most often described. And the idea is the approach that we use broadly in much of psychology with survey instruments, that if someone endorses these items, we can reasonably infer that they have had this type of experience that we're examining. And there are various statistical ways of analyzing that and validating the measure and all that kind of stuff. But yes, essentially being able to ask people, same thing with near-death experiences. We have a near-death experience scale that we use for that as well.
The Grayson scale, it's often referred to.
Yes. Bruce Grayson scale. Yeah. And it's got, I think, 20 something, maybe 22, 24 items. Sorry, I can't remember, but basically it's a longer one. The one that I'm putting out is 11 items. And do you want me to just read the items?
Let's do that.
Goal is just to measure it. So we have the beginning where basically there's a little bit of explanation to people that, this is not a metaphor. We want you to really, et cetera. So there's a bit of clarification there. And then it says, the following completions of this sentence. So they're asked to rate the completions of this sentence. I have had an experience of extraordinary light, ... that was filled with profound love, that seemed to be the essence of life, that showed me that everything is unified, that expanded my understanding in a profound way, that seemed more clear and real than anything I have ever experienced, that fundamentally transformed me, where I was completely immersed in extraordinary luminosity, in which the world around me became illuminated with extraordinary light, that I found to be the true nature of reality itself, where I communed with one or more luminous beings who shone with extraordinary light and or shone with such light myself, and that I felt to be the essence of divinity. And so each of these are actually based on a sort of theorized facet of the experience. And, we don't have to get too deep in the weeds on that. But essentially, the idea is that if someone highly endorses these 11 items beyond a certain threshold, then we can we just use it for correlational research. But essentially, if someone endorses these items, we can reasonably infer that they've had the type of experience that we're studying.
Reflecting back on our earlier conversation of Kabbalah and the various mystics who write about light, you referred to the Ein Sof Or, which is a light that is no light at all. And it's sort of a a dark light. You also get, I think, the same idea in Buddhism, like a pure void, which is luminous, but only in the sense of it being metaphorical, that maybe it illuminates the heart in some way, that it's not light in the more common way we think of light, but it's still described as light.
Yeah, that's true. And then there are also descriptions from various traditions of first encountering a void and then having to push through that to get to a light that is described more in luminous terms. That's present in Tantra, some Kabbalistic thought, etc. And it's also a pattern that you see in near-death experiences. People going into a void, and then the light appears, they go to the light, and then it's clearly described in terms of light that also feels like love and seems to contain information or wisdom and things like that. So, again, whenever people, we have these concepts from religious history, and so people have had an experience. They've put together teachings from that experience. The teachings have been passed forward through time and developed in various ways, and also been handed down to people who did not have the experience themselves. And so, to a large degree, I think we have to be cautious about drawing any really firm conclusions from any tradition. And really, the main thing is examining the experience as it occurs today, with the traditions as a very interesting backdrop, and their concepts a very interesting backdrop. But the greatest weight of evidence, I'm always thinking in the scientific terms, the greatest weight of evidence as to the nature of the phenomenon is the contemporary experiences. But yeah, it is interesting for sure, especially that it matches the pattern, those descriptions of going through a dark light, which is kind of hard to even imagine what a dark light would be. One of my participants did describe this, and he had trouble describing it. But essentially, passing through a darker light to a more effulgent light that feels more like a plenum rather than a void does also seem to be a pattern. And it's interesting that happens in near-death experiences where the person has not been taught about that or anything, as they might have been in a mystical tradition, say.
And some of the mystical writings, like the 12th century writings of the Persian mystic Suhrawardi, refer to many, many different levels and emanations of light. It's almost sort of a fractal pattern of different kinds of light emerging from other kinds of light. And you get the same thing in the Kabbalah with the tree of life, with all the different lights associated with each of the sephirot, or one could think of them as the fractal faces of the deity. We also have, in contemporary times, other descriptions that are very different from what we've talked about so far. For example, the idea that a charismatic person, a saint, will radiate light that's seen by other people, and it's depicted in halos.
Yeah. It's often thought of in terms of being like the glory of God becoming manifest. It's described with Jesus in the Transfiguration, light emanating from Moses' face at one point. So, and yeah, saints, different saints, Hindu saints. It's in a variety of contexts. There was an interesting observation by Hollenbach, scholar Hollenbach, that essentially, according to him, regardless of where this appears in these different traditions, the degree of luminosity that emanates from something is sort of an indication of the degree of its holiness or sanctity or whatever. And even if you it makes so much sense. And this is, again, the symbolic or metaphorical versus the literal becomes troublesome, because even if you start to imagine, how would you think something is holy or sacred? Like if you had to picture something being holy or sacred, you would almost naturally imagine it glowing or something like that. And so there's almost this element of, how much of it is symbolic. But clearly, if we hear people give experience accounts and they say, no, I saw this is what happened, then I think we can reasonably assume that they're not speaking metaphorically. But then whenever it is in terms of concepts and metaphysical systems, theologies, then it becomes more subject to the possibility that it is being discussed more metaphorically. So this is just an ongoing, it's an issue, especially if you want to study it in a sort of religious studies context, more that modality. Then this is something that you could definitely, a person could make a long study of trying to parse that out, essentially.
Well, there's also the question of bioluminosity. We know fireflies. Everybody knows about fireflies and glowworms. They emit light, but there are many, many other examples in nature of bioluminosity. And I'll share with you something you may not be aware of, because the New Thinking Aloud channel now has a relationship with the California Institute for Human Science, founded by a Japanese researcher, Dr. Hiroshi Motoyama, who developed a detector that can detect single photons coming out of the body. And he determined through his research that the areas associated with the chakras of yoga seem to emit more photons than other parts of the body.
Wow, that's very interesting. That's very interesting. See, it leads, these kinds of things, really do make you wonder. I mean, I just study experience. I'm not a parapsychologist. I'm not trying to say, whether it's objectively real or anything like that. But I mean, you do have to, as somebody who studies this, you do have to wonder about things like that and its relationship to physical light as well, that can actually be measured with things like machines, machine instruments. There's also a theory by a gentleman by the name of Simononok, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, who was at the University of Arizona, but he's got this entire theory about how essentially I hope I'm not going to butcher it here. It's been a little bit since I've read about it, but essentially the background radiation and virtual photons, he's got a theory he was a neuroscientist. He's got a theory about how the photons in the brain may actually be connecting to the sort of background virtual photon radiation that's present throughout all of space. So, you have interesting approaches to looking at it in terms of, how does the physical connect, if one assumes that to have its own sort of independent existence, objective existence, then how could it be that the physical connects to that, or that physical light might relate to it? And I find those things certainly fascinating. I've also read recently about a plasma physicist discussing how essentially there's a lot of aspects of plasma that we have not been made very public knowledge, that it may have qualities of self-awareness, and that we actually have plasma in our own body. And it's, as we understand subatomic particles, it's not really like dust per se, or gas even. It's all very interesting. I would probably butcher it. I'm not a plasma physicist, but yeah.
Well, I think it's fair to say that there are many, many scientific mysteries that we don't have a good handle on yet. And maybe 1,000 years from now, science will have advanced to the point where we can actually begin to grasp some of these things. Another area that you allude to briefly in your book, I know as a parapsychologist, there are many reports of light emerging from a person as they are dying.
Yeah, absolutely. And so on the one hand, in near-death experiences, we know that we see light, and we also have it in shared death experiences, but also even in what are not necessarily categorized as shared death experiences, there are experiences of otherwise just normal people who happen to be present with a dying person, that there is a sort of flash of light that occurs at the moment of death. And yet again, just a fascinating thing. Different light phenomena that we observe and that we are aware of to various degrees, it hasn't so far been clear the extent to which they are mystical luminosity, because to the extent that they've been recorded or measured, it didn't really have anything to do with the mystical qualities associated. So, for instance, in contemplative science, there are all these experiences of light that occur in a contemplative context. People are meditating in deep states of meditation, but they never measured whether there were mystical qualities present. So it's not clear if it relates. So that's another important reason that we need to have the scale. Because if we did a study of people who had experienced this, as we do with near-death experience and stuff like that, and they endorse these items that they experienced some mystical qualities along with it when it occurred, then we might suppose. But then again, it might be a separate phenomenon, still an interesting phenomenon. But if it is purely visual, then it could be a distinct a distinct thing. So
it's likely there are many different types of mystical luminosity. I think I shared with you earlier the story of George Harrison, the Beatle, the musician, who his goal was to die consciously. He wanted to be fully awake through the dying process, and he died of cancer. His wife, Olivia, was with him in the room, and she said that at the moment of his death, the light coming from him in a darkened room was so bright, she said, if you had been there with a camera, you could have photographed it.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? And certainly you can tell from the music that he makes and just the way he was that he was somebody. And it's a fact that he was very interested in mysticism and spiritual practice, and so in a way it's not surprising that he, of all musicians at least, would have been found to emanate light upon his death. But it just kind of is. Yeah, it's really cool to hear that. You told me about that, and I had not heard that. And so, yet again, Nikola Tesla, George Harrison, you have all these instances of light with all these significant figures. And like Dr. Hood was saying, it's always been under our nose. And until we really point it out and really make a point of studying it, it kind of just passes under the radar a little bit. But yeah.
Well, let's talk about some of the interviews you did to gather phenomenological reports.
So what I did is I conducted some quantitative studies where I used my survey instruments that I had created to measure the presence of it. And then I'm a big advocate for integrating qualitative and especially phenomenological methods into the scientific process in psychological science. And I think it's really important, especially in somewhat enigmatic experiences such as mystical luminosity experience. So essentially what I did is a follow-up study to the quantitative study where I selected a small sample, which with phenomenological interviewing, it almost necessarily has to be a small sample, of participants who were, the sampling method was intended to be representative. So 3 each from the main 4 categories that it most often occurs in, which are psychedelic, spontaneous, spiritual practices, and near death. And so I tried to have as equal a representation of those as possible. And so I interviewed 15 individuals, and they were amazing. It was amazing interviewing these people, and the insights that came from it, and analyzing the transcripts. It was just probably the most enjoyable part of the research, because it's quite a different thing. When you turn something into a number, it's one thing, and we have to do that for science, and I'm not suggesting we don't. But whenever you do a qualitative phenomenological interview and you really hear all the details and the personal accounts, it's really pretty amazing, and so I enjoyed that a lot. But I came up with several themes from it, which themes tend to be the output of most qualitative research. So you go through and you're analyzing using words as data, and you're aggregating the meaningful statements that they made into sort of sub-themes. You're sort of creating a process of abstraction where you're eventually finding large-scale themes that are common across all of the participants. And so there were a variety of experiences. Some were out-of-body near-death experiences. Some were Kundalini. I had one psychedelically facilitated Kundalini experience, which is fascinating. Spontaneous ones. I had one woman who was literally just walking across a room on a normal day and just had a flip into a complete alternate reality where there was this light, like a near-death experience, emanating and like speaking to her. So a pretty wide variety of ways in which the light was experienced. But nevertheless, in all of them, the light was described as having these qualities. And so again, I think the idea that it's a singular light occurring in different ways, what I refer to in the theory as formats, but that the qualities, in my opinion, indicate that it is somehow that these are unified. They're experiencing the same thing in some way, but in different formats. And so that was also noticeable in the transcripts as well, in the interviews.
Now, you referenced the idea of Kundalini a couple of times here, and I think many of our viewers will understand Kundalini. We've referred to it in previous interviews, but for the benefit of those who may not be familiar with that concept, how how did you use or understand that term in your study?
Sure. So the Kundalini phenomenon, the word Kundalini originates in the yogic and Hindu traditions. Essentially, it's an experience that could be best characterized, I think, as a sense of, well, there's a component of it that in when psychologists have been studying it, they have referred to it as energy-like somatic experience. But essentially, there's a perception of energy that typically starts at the base of the spine and moves up the spine, and then eventually culminates in an experience that is more pervasive whenever it reaches the top and emerges from the crown. And so this is, it's, as compared to other experiences, it's perhaps a more somatic experience, more body-oriented. My participant described, well, actually both of them described it as being a sensation similar to electricity at the base of the spine, like heat and electricity. And the one that had the psychedelically facilitated Kundalini experience had a much even more detailed description of it, being essentially he could actually feel how, as it moved up the spine and hit those various energy centers, which you just said you're measuring photons from, or someone is, that essentially as it moved up, he could tell in a way or sense that it was somehow being purified or refined, to the point that when it emerged from his crown, it was this sort of pure luminosity that felt like love and was like this liquid light of love. Whereas where it had begun at the base of the spine, it was sort of more like a charge of electrical heat. And so it's like a base energy being sort of refined into something that is seemingly is different qualities once it is refined. So that's a very interesting, detailed account from one individual. And also that it had to pass through various blockages, energy blockages. It had to actually break through. He felt it in his entire body. So that was a very, very interesting interview and experience there. But yeah, so Kundalini, but essentially, if you want to just look at it as a category, the sort of sense of this electrical heat energy feeling going up to the spine and then culminating in a somewhat more classically mystical experience, you might say, when it reaches the top.
If I understand you correctly, you have arrived at the conclusion that this mystical luminosity is I use the word loosely, a thing, that it's real.
Well, essentially, it's an experience that people have. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not within the framework that I'm operating. It's the tendency in general in science to try as quickly as possible to get to an objective thing that we can say it is, like the physical sciences do. I'm taking a phenomenological scientific approach. So essentially, I'm making people's experience the focus of my research. So I think in as much as the experience, like a category of experience, it's a thing, I believe, yes. Now, is it possible that there are types? I believe there are types. It's clear from the phenomenological description that there are types. Could there be other light experiences that do not fit this? Yes. If they're purely visual, we also know that those exist, even in the same contexts as the contexts where mystical luminosity experience. So in a way, you're taking, in terms of constructing this as literally a scientific construct, a theoretical concept that's very clearly defined and operationalized. Essentially, it's based in its phenomenological features. So the inference there is that if you notice these phenomenological features occurring together enough, it does appear to be a specific type of experience. And so, yeah, in that sense. Now, if you wanted to start trying to make an analysis as to whether it was objectively real outside of the person's experience, then you get into the realm of parapsychology, and that's just not my profession. But it's interesting to think about, and certainly that type of research, like the measuring the photons and what that might imply about energy centers in the body. I mean, I certainly find all those things fascinating. It's just not what I do.
Well, it's worth pointing out that there are physicalists who have looked into this and who claim, at least with regard to the near-death experience, that this mystical luminosity could be accounted for by oxygen deprivation in the brain.
Yeah. So this is I actually know one of the researchers on that paper. He's a great guy. I got nothing against the people who've come up with this interpretation. And in a way, they're doing just what they have to do as scientists, which is try to come up with ways of explaining that are more parsimonious. And so, no shade. No shade. However, this is what I would call an example of a problem in the methodological approach to attempting to explain these phenomena. I've actually given it a name in a recent writing that I co-authored with Dr. Hood. I'm calling it the abstraction matching fallacy. So essentially, where you take an abstraction of one phenomenon and an abstraction of a pathological phenomenon and at a sufficient level of abstraction, they begin to resemble one another. However, if not abstracted, if you examine the details, they most certainly do not represent one another. And so inasmuch as those abstractions, the entire point of making the abstraction is to represent an actual phenomenon in the world, then clearly you're making a mistake by trying to match these things, which only match when they have been taken at a level of abstraction that's that high. So the classic example for me that's really easy is the tunnel in near-death experiences. So with the tunnel, you have this common explanation that was offered, I believe Blackmore and others have discussed it, where essentially they're saying that it's tunnel vision, same phenomenon as tunnel vision. And if you read the actual descriptions of the tunnel from near-death experiencers, especially when they give details of the tunnel, sometimes they just say, I passed through a tunnel, but when they give details, it does not remotely match the description of tunnel vision. However, if you take tunnel vision over here and you go, dark tunnel with light at the center, and then you take near-death experience tunnels over here and you're like, darkness, and it kind of looks like a tunnel with a light. And at a sufficient level of abstraction, those begin to resemble one another, and you can make a sort of explanatory leap, I would say, to try and say one is the other. However, that's only if you disregard those, in my opinion, critical phenomenological details, which are clearly different between the two phenomena. So this is one of the reasons that I believe qualitative research is extremely important in psychological science, especially studying these experiences. Because if you do that, then you might say, well, okay, we have a new hypothesis. This is significant. And then you start to design studies to try and test it. You're essentially wasting resources on something that, from a phenomenological assessment, clearly appears to be a dead end. There's no possibility that those two things, if you really look at the details of what's described, that one will actually explain the other. And, so you can go test it and fail to verify that if you want to, but it's a waste. It's a waste of resources, because by just simply regarding the details of the experience as consequential, you can avoid that waste of time and resources. That's an obvious dead end to anybody who's sufficiently familiar with the details described.
You did say that you don't mean to throw shade on any of these people, and that from their point of view, they are trying to be, you use the term parsimonious, which I think from their point of view means if we deviate in any way from scientific materialism, then we're violating parsimony, because materialism for them is the bedrock. On the other hand, people who are idealists would say materialism itself violates parsimony, because our direct experience always starts with consciousness itself.
Yeah. I've definitely, the context where I've heard that most often put forward is via Bernardo Kastrup. But yes, essentially that the fact that consciousness is actually more intimate to our experience than is a dead world, that we actually infer is a dead world. It's actually, consciousness itself is more intrinsic to our experience. That's an interesting argument. I'll leave it to the philosophers to settle that one, but it is, I think, a valid point to be made. But I also think that there are, less abstract reasons to think that there may be something beyond the physical. So I'm not a physicalist myself. In my research, I'm not trying to, prove the objective existence of these things. I'm just studying them as experiences. But as a person who has my own beliefs, I'm not a physicalist. And the reason that I believe that is because of a careful assessment of experiential evidence. such as, to me, the most convincing is near-death experience, and particularly veridical perceptions from near-death experience. Once you really look into that phenomenon, that people have perceptions that can be verified by third parties that do not, there's no real alternative explanation for how they might have known that, other than actually being out of their body as they seem to be, other than maybe resorting to the psi hypothesis. But then if you do that, then you're acknowledging psi, and so you're still in territory of weird stuff. But regardless, once you consider that, even though it's not demonstrated in large numbers, it is individual cases. But as William James said, you only need one white crow to demonstrate that white crows exist. And if you can validate that a single white crow, it was not bleached or painted or anything, then from that point, white crows exist, right? And so it's not always necessary to have several dozen large random control trials to start to come to some conclusions. And so for me, evidence such as that and many other things, for me personally, indicates that there's definitely something more than the physical going on here. So yeah, but it is, all belief systems tend to operate in very similar ways. That's actually a kind of study in psychology of religion. And so developing these sort of dogmas, sort of attacking opposing beliefs, even like shaming people if they stray from the chosen dogmas and things like this. These are all, secular beliefs are not immune to the way that belief systems operate psychologically. And certainly that does occur and is under-acknowledged, I would say, the degree to which that's occurring specifically in by themselves, at least, in secular beliefs like physicalism, materialism, and things like that. But I do believe that is going on for sure. And that even though people ostensibly are just saying that they're trying to be parsimonious, I can't help but feel that that's going on in the background. And it's a sort of underlying motivation. Yeah.
Well, I'm under the impression that for yourself, you've chosen phenomenology as a way of threading the needle, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And, actually, if you want to make an assessment as to the likelihood that something is hallucinatory versus an actual perception, take, for instance, the veridical near-death experience case. The details are clearly important. The details in that case that they perceived that were verified, right? So considering phenomenological details when you assess these things is actually important for that question as well. But also it's important for more pragmatic questions, which is more what I'm addressing, which is like, what impact does this have on the person, on their psychological life, that transformation that we were alluding to earlier? And what are the consequences and impacts? And because on a more practical level, that's, in a mental health context, for instance, this is actually a largely unaddressed population with very specific and unique mental health needs, in my opinion. I'm not saying that we should give them our SSRIs or something. I'm just saying that essentially there are mental health consequences to having these experiences, particularly existential isolation that people experience and things of that nature, which is a concept in psychology that essentially you feel isolated from those around you. You could be surrounded by people, but you feel isolated because nobody else sees the world the way that you do. And that can have real impacts. And people do describe facing psychosocial difficulties to a large extent from these experiences. It's not all just positivity. The experience itself is very positive, and on some internal level, it's very positive that they feel that they have a connection to the divine and things like that. But in terms of how they reintegrate that with their life as they knew it, before, it can often be very, very challenging. And so I think this is actually an unaddressed population within a mental health context that needs a specific kind of care, maybe a very spiritually aware or mindful form of care where they don't try to invalidate people's transformed ontological beliefs or metaphysical beliefs as a result of the experience. I think that's a huge problem. The way that sometimes, unfortunately, these things are handled in the mental health field is essentially they're told that these are sort of delusions. They had a hallucination and now they're believing they're hallucinations, and that's problematic. And yet pathologized and all these issues that come along with that. So anyway, there's a little bit of tangent there, but yeah, I think it's on a pragmatic level, it's important to approach it phenomenologically in terms of the impacts that it has on their life.
It's not a tangent to me. That's a very crucial issue. We have an audience of 170,000 subscribers on this particular YouTube channel, and I think a very high percentage of them are individuals who are having mystical experiences of one type or another and are looking for some validation, some sense of social support. It's one of the reasons I try to upload 4 to 5 videos every week for these people.
Absolutely. And it's a great work that you're doing for sure. And, that is a thing that you see. That's a pattern that you see. That's a pattern that I saw in my interviewing, that essentially people would come back from this experience. And, look, you've sort of dissolved into the infinite mind of God, in this luminous mind, at least in your perception and the way that you interpret it. And then you come back and you have to do the laundry, go to your job and try to sell something. The two things don't seem very compatible. It can be very difficult to integrate the one into the other, or very often it results in changes. So you have this change, the results of which are felt very strongly internally. And in many cases, the people feel that they have to alter their external life in ways that are more resonant with that internal change that they have felt from the experience. So changes in vocation, changes in friend networks, all of these things, especially depending on the background that they came from. If they came from a background and a friend network that was very, very contrary to the type of person that a person typically becomes after this experience, then there can be, a lot of cutting off networks and seeking on spiritual community online. That is definitely a pattern that you see as well, because obviously people who've had these experiences are very dispersed out there in the world, and it's not easy to find people in your nearby locales that have had it. And so the default thing that people would go to as well is are there any kind of online communities around this? And indeed, people do find them. They find them in Facebook groups. They find them in your channel, places like your channel, all kinds of places where these groups are forming now these days. But that is where a lot of people are finding their spiritual community. And it's great. It's great that it's available, because during so much of history before the internet, these people, who knows how many people out there were just essentially that had this experience, transformed the way they see the world, and then they just live out the rest of their life without really knowing anybody that could serve as, that they could commune with about it in with someone who has a similar belief, which is important. There's a reason that people feel a special sense of community in their church, say, because when you're with others who see the world the same as you do, it just has a really positive psychological effect that people yearn for.
Well, Jonathan Dinsmore, this has been a wonderful discussion. I commend you for the pioneering work that you're doing. I think you have a brilliant career ahead of you, and I hope that we can have many more interviews as your work progresses.
Oh, absolutely. Anytime. And thank you so much for having me. It's really been a joy speaking with you today.
It's been a pleasure to be with you and to share your insights with the New Thinking Aloud viewers. And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy.